He grabbed her wrist in the middle of the hospital corridor, a man in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and he didn't even lower his voice. You will delete every photo. You will move back to America. And if you speak his name again in this country, your baby will grow up without a mother. Amara Brooks didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood there in her scrubs, ultrasound photo still warm from the printer, and she looked this stranger dead in the eye while her heart tried to beat its way out of her chest. She had sent one photo to the wrong number. One photo. And somehow, in the span of 72 hours, Korea's most feared crime family knew her name, her address, her shift schedule, and the exact number of weeks along she was. If you've ever felt like your whole life pivoted on a single second, a wrong turn, a misdial, a door you wish you'd never opened, then you already understand exactly how Amara Brooks felt standing in that hallway. This story will take everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the people we become when we have nothing left to protect except the ones we love. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and let's begin. The ultrasound appointment was at 2:15 on a Tuesday, and Amara had taken the subway alone. She'd told herself she preferred it that way. Fewer questions. Nobody watching her face when the technician asked, for the second time, whether the father would be joining. She'd smiled the way she'd learned to smile in the 6 weeks since Marcus left, tight, controlled, practiced enough that it almost looked real. And she'd said, "It's just me today." Just me today had become something of a personal mantra. She was 29 years old, 14 weeks pregnant, and living in an apartment in Mapogu that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cigarettes, no matter how many candles she burned. She'd come to Seoul on a nursing contract 18 months ago, fallen in love with the city before she'd fallen in love with Marcus Reed, and then watched Marcus Reed take a flight back to Atlanta the morning after she showed him the positive test, because he had, in his own words, a lot going on right now. A lot going on. She'd spent the first week replaying that phrase at 2 in the morning, turning it over in her hands like something she'd found on the ground and couldn't identify. Then she'd gone back to work, because the alternative was sitting in that cigarette-smelling apartment thinking about her mother's voice on the phone saying, "Baby, just come home," and she wasn't ready to admit that out loud yet. Seoul had become hers in a way Atlanta never quite had. The rhythms of it. The subway lines she'd memorized. The pojangmatcha cart near the hospital where the old man always gave her extra fish cake because she'd once helped his daughter fill out paperwork. She wasn't ready to give that up. She wasn't ready to give up the person she'd become here, even if that person was currently sitting in a vinyl chair waiting for a sonogram with a phone full of unanswered texts from her mother and nobody to hold her hand. The technician was a small, precise woman named Park, who communicated almost entirely through efficient hand gestures and the occasional approving nod. She spread the cold gel across Amara's stomach without ceremony and pressed the transducer down, and the monitor flickered, and then, there. A heartbeat. Fast and certain. A blur of movement that resolved slowly into something with limbs, something with a profile. Amara pressed her lips together. Her eyes went hot. She hadn't expected to cry. She'd been so focused on being practical about all of this. The finances, the insurance paperwork, the logistics of single parenthood in a country where she didn't share the dominant language, that she'd forgotten, briefly, that there was an actual person involved. A small, currently the size of a lemon person with a functioning heartbeat who had no idea what was happening outside and was simply continuing to exist, undeterred. Nurse Park printed 4 images and handed them over with a nod that managed to convey both clinical efficiency and something warmer underneath. Amara sat up and looked at the photos for a long moment in the dimmed room. Then she took out her phone and sent one to her best friend Jade, back in Atlanta. She typed, "Look at this little one," she hit send. She was pulling her jacket on when the reply came back. She assumed it would be a string of heart emojis. Jade communicated largely through emojis and voice memos recorded while driving, which was technically illegal but very Jade. Instead, the message read, "That's my child." Amara stopped moving. She read it again. Then she looked at the contact name. And that was when she understood what she'd done. She hadn't sent it to Jade Kim, who was in her favorites and whose name began with J.A. She had sent it to a contact listed only as KDH. a number she'd written down 3 weeks ago when the hospital's administrative office had forwarded her a query about a substantial donation, and she'd been asked to relay it to the appropriate department head. She'd never spoken to the man. She'd simply saved the number in case there was follow-up. KDH. She stared at the 3 letters and felt something cold move through her chest. The message was still sitting there. That's my child. No punctuation, no explanation. She typed back immediately. I'm so sorry this was sent to the wrong person. Please disregard and delete. 30 seconds passed. Then, I understand, but I'd like to explain something. Are you available to speak? She almost laughed. She actually breathed out a short, disbelieving sound that Nurse Park, passing in the hallway outside, probably heard and attributed to the standard emotional aftermath of a first clear ultrasound image. She typed, I don't think that's necessary. He replied, I think it might be. It concerns your safety. She looked at those 3 words for a long time. Your safety. She should have closed the app. She should have blocked the number, called her contract agency, asked them who exactly had been on the other end of that administrative query. She should have done the sensible thing, which was to treat a cryptic message from an unknown number as exactly what it was. Instead, she sat back down in the vinyl chair in the dim sonogram room and typed, What do you mean by that? His name, she learned later, meant very little to her because she hadn't grown up in Korea and hadn't spent enough time in the particular social circles where his name would have produced a specific kind of silence. Kang Do-hyun, 36 years old, the kind of face that photographers loved and that he himself seemed to find inconvenient, all controlled angles, the jaw set like he was permanently bracing for something. If you searched his name, you found press releases about real estate acquisitions, and the occasional photograph from a charity gala where he stood slightly apart from everyone else, holding a glass of something he wasn't drinking. The KDH Group owned 14 buildings in Seoul alone. It had interests in Busan, Tokyo, and Singapore. It employed over 3,000 people who likely did not know, because most of them genuinely did not need to know, that their employer's family had maintained a different kind of organizational structure for the better part of 40 years. One that did not appear in any financial filing. One whose meetings were not minuted, and whose decisions were not appealable. He had been 19 when his father died. He had not been given time to grieve. By the time Amara's misdirected message reached him, he was sitting in the back of an SUV en route to a meeting he had not requested and could not cancel, his phone buzzing with 17 unopened messages from people he could not ignore, and his uncle's voice still in his ear from that morning's phone call. The marriage negotiation is final, Do-hyun. We've given you enough time. You'll meet her next week. He'd been staring out the window when the notification appeared. An unknown number. An image. He'd opened it because he opened everything. Vigilance was not optional in his position. And then he'd seen it. The shape on the monitor. The timestamp in the corner of the image. The gestational note printed beneath. He didn't know why he'd typed what he typed. He was not, by training or temperament, impulsive. He thought before he spoke. He measured before he moved. But something about that image, the ordinariness of it, the completely unceremonious proof that somewhere another person's ordinary life was continuing without complication, had hit him in a place he didn't have adequate defenses for. That's my child. He'd pressed send and immediately understood that he'd made an error. The woman's response came within seconds, polite and alarmed and perfectly reasonable, and he'd sat with his own idiocy for a moment before typing back. Not an explanation, not quite an apology, something that was true, which was that there was a reason she needed to know what her misdirected message had set in motion, and he owed her that much. She didn't block him. He noted that, filed it. She typed, What do you mean by that? And he looked at the message for a moment and then typed back an address. A coffee shop in Mapogu, 3 blocks from Seoul Western Hospital, where she worked, because he'd had her verified within 4 minutes of receiving the image. He told himself it was standard security protocol. He didn't examine that reasoning too closely. He typed, Tomorrow, noon. I'll explain in person. You can bring someone if it makes you more comfortable. She didn't respond for 11 minutes. Then, I'll think about it. He knew, from the particular quality of that answer, that she would come. She came alone. She told herself it was a calculated decision, public place, daytime, a coffee shop, she knew, where the barista recognized her face. If she brought someone, that someone would ask questions she wasn't ready to answer, and she'd have to explain the wrong number, and the cryptic reply, and the fact that she was sitting here at all, which would make her sound either reckless or desperate, neither of which she was prepared to be out loud. She arrived 7 minutes early and chose a table near the window so she could see the door. He arrived at 11:58. She recognized him from the KDH group website she'd looked at the previous evening. He was taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd formed an expectation. He was alone, which she'd also not anticipated, and dressed in the kind of way that was quietly expensive rather than loudly so. No visible security, no entourage. He scanned the room when he entered, a fast, practiced sweep, and his eyes landed on her and stayed. He crossed to her table and said, in careful, accented English, "Ms. Brooks, thank you for coming. I'm sorry for yesterday." She said, "You said something about my safety." He sat down. He didn't order anything. He put his phone face down on the table between them, which she recognized as a gesture. The deliberate removal of an escape route, a signal that he intended to be present. "Yes," he said. "I did." And then he told her. Not everything. She would understand later that what he told her in that coffee shop was the edited version, the version with the sharpest edges filed down to something manageable. But he told her enough. He told her that within his family's organization, communication security was absolute. Every message he sent on his primary device was monitored by a security team that answered not to him, but to his uncle. He told her that the image she'd accidentally sent had been intercepted and flagged within minutes. He told her that the flag had been escalated, and that certain people within the organization had already begun asking questions about who she was and what her connection to him might be. He told her this calmly. His hands were flat on the table. He had, she noticed, the stillness of someone who had learned stillness the hard way. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "So your people know my name?" "Yes." "Because I sent a photo to the wrong number." He didn't flinch from it. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know." "That's not a complete answer." He was quiet for a moment. "Because if I hadn't told you and something happened, I wouldn't be able to live with it." That answer landed differently than she'd expected. She'd been prepared for calculated. She hadn't been prepared for that particular brand of honest. She said, "What do you mean, something happened?" He said, "My uncle has been pressuring me to marry and produce an heir. The timing of your message, a pregnancy announcement arriving on my phone, was unfortunate." "Unfortunate," she repeated. "He's a man who looks for leverage," Do-hyun said. "That's all I can tell you right now. But I wanted you to know that you may want to be careful in the coming days. Vary your routes. Be aware of who is around you." She stared at him. "You're telling me to watch my back," she said, "because I accidentally sent you an ultrasound." "Yes." The word sat between them in the small coffee shop, completely surreal, completely specific. Amara put both hands around her cup and looked down at the table. She thought about the subway ride this morning. She thought about the corridor outside her apartment, the one with the flickering third light that she'd been meaning to report to the landlord. She thought about her baby, currently the size of a lemon, with a heartbeat she'd heard 2 days ago. She said, "If this becomes a problem for me, a real problem, you'll tell me." He said, "Yes." She looked up. "That's not a favor, that's a requirement. I'm not in whatever this is. I had nothing to do with your family or your uncle or any of it. I made a mistake with my phone." "I know," he said. "So if your people come near me, they won't," he said. And then he paused. "I'll make sure of it." She searched his face for something to distrust. She was good at reading people. 12-hour nursing shifts had sharpened that into something close to instinct. And what she read on Kang Do-hyun's face was not a man who was lying to her. It was a man who was telling her a careful, partial truth, and knew she could tell the difference and was hoping she'd take it anyway. She took it anyway. She said, "I have to get back to work." He stood when she stood. That surprised her slightly. It was an old-fashioned gesture, the kind her grandfather had done without thinking. She didn't comment on it. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Your uncle," she said. "He's the one who monitors your messages." "Yes." "Then why did you reply to me on that phone? Why didn't you just delete it?" He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "I reacted before I thought about it." It was she would think about later, the most honest thing a powerful man had ever said to her. She walked back out into the Seoul afternoon, ultrasound photos still folded in her jacket pocket, and she told herself that was the end of it. She told herself that for exactly 4 more days. On the 5th day, she woke up to 17 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and an email notification from a forum she'd never heard of that had tagged her name in a post. She sat up in bed in the half-dark and opened the link. The post had been live for 6 hours. It included her name. It included the ultrasound image, the actual image, with the hospital timestamp and the gestational notation clearly visible. The caption above it read, in Korean and in English both, Mafia Boss Kang Do-hyun's secret heir? Mystery woman revealed. Her phone was already ringing again. She let it ring. She sat in the dark of her Mapogu apartment, the one that still smelled faintly of cigarettes, and she looked at the screen, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly rather than with dramatics, that she had been right to be afraid and wrong to think it was over. 4 days ago, a man in a coffee shop had said, I'll make sure of it. She picked up her phone and found his number and called it. He answered on the second ring. She said, it's already a problem. A beat of silence, then his voice, very controlled, very quiet. I know, I just found out. Where are you right now? My apartment. Don't go to work today. I'm sending someone to explain the situation and will... No, she said. You come. Not someone. You. Another beat. All right, he said. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up and sat in the dark and put one hand on her stomach where her baby was sleeping, unaware, continuing simply to exist. She thought about a man who'd said, I don't know when she asked him why he'd replied. She thought about how that particular honesty was either the most dangerous thing about him or the most human thing, and she wasn't sure yet which one she was dealing with. Outside, Seoul was already moving. Subway trains, pojangmacha carts, a city going about the business of itself. Amara Brooks sat still and waited, and the ultrasound photo on her bedside table looked back at her, and somewhere across the city, a mafia boss got into an SUV and told his driver to go faster. He was there in 38 minutes. She knew because she'd been watching the clock on her microwave, which was the only clock in the apartment she'd bothered to set correctly, and she'd been sitting at her kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She hadn't drunk, counting the minutes the way she used to count contractions during long shifts. Not because it helped, but because numbers gave the hands something to do. The knock came at 7:42 in the morning. She opened the door without checking the peephole, which she recognized even in the moment as a failure of the instincts she'd just spent the last hour telling herself to trust. He was standing in the corridor alone. No bodyguards visible, though she had the distinct impression that wasn't the same thing as there being none. He was wearing the same kind of dark, unremarkable clothing as the day in the coffee shop, the kind of clothes designed not to be remembered, and his face had the look of someone who had not slept and was not going to mention it. She stepped back. He came in. He didn't look around the apartment the way some people did, cataloging, assessing. He looked at her, just her, straight and direct and with an attention that was, she was starting to understand, simply how he was built. Show me, he said. She handed him her phone. The forum post was still open. He read it without expression, his thumb scrolling once, and then he set the phone down on her kitchen table with the same careful precision he'd used with everything she'd seen him touch. How many people have your number? He said. What? Your personal number. How many people have it? She felt a flicker of irritation. That's not... The forum post has my name in it, and you're asking about my contacts? The post came from inside, he said. Someone in the organization fed your information to an external account and timed the upload for early morning when moderation is slowest. I need to understand the exposure on your end. She stared at him. There is no exposure on my end. I'm a nurse. I sent a photo to the wrong number. I know that. Then stop talking to me like I'm a security variable. He stopped. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, small, barely visible, but there. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. She hadn't expected that either. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Someone inside your organization leaked my name, she said. That's what you're telling me. Yes. Why would they do that? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She could tell the difference now, after 2 meetings. He was deciding how much of the truth to spend. My uncle has been applying pressure, he said finally. The marriage negotiation I mentioned, he wanted it formalized by the end of this month. I've been resistant. And the leak is his way of forcing your hand. It creates a situation, he said. If the story spreads, a Kong heir, an unknown foreign woman, a child, it creates a narrative that the organization can use. It also creates a target. The word landed in the quiet kitchen and stayed there. A target, she repeated, for anyone who wants leverage over me, or over my uncle, through me. He paused. Or for my uncle himself if he decides cooperation from you would be useful. Amara put both hands flat on the table. I want you to be very specific right now, she said. Are you telling me that a criminal organization knows where I live, knows my name, and may attempt to use me and my unborn child as some kind of bargaining chip in your family's internal power structure? He met her eyes. Yes. And this happened because I sent you a photo. Yes. Kang Do-hyun. Yes. I need you to understand, she said, and her voice was very steady, which was how she knew she was genuinely frightened, because that was what happened to her voice under real pressure. It went quieter, not louder. That I have a 15-week pregnancy, a nursing contract that ends in 4 months, no family in this country, and approximately zero interest in being involved in organized crime of any kind. I came to Seoul to work. I stayed because I liked it here. That is the complete extent of my relationship to anything you are describing. I know, he said. Then fix it. The words came out harder than she'd planned. She watched them hit him. He didn't deflect. I'm going to, he said. How? He leaned forward slightly. The leak came from within a specific communication channel. I have people who can trace it. Once I know who made the upload, I can… He stopped. Chose different words. I can neutralize the situation. Neutralize, she said. Shut it down. Remove the post. Create enough pressure on the source that it doesn't happen again. She studied his face. And your uncle? A pause. That's more complicated. How much more complicated? My uncle has run this organization for 20 years, Do-hyun said. I inherited leadership in name. In practice, he exhaled through his nose. In practice, he still controls most of the operational infrastructure. I have the public face, the companies, the legal legitimacy. He has the loyalty of the men who've been there since before I was born. So you're the hood ornament, she said. He blinked. For the organization, she said. You're the clean face on the front of a car that he's still driving. He was quiet for a moment. That's accurate. And now he's using me to keep the hood ornament in place. That's also accurate. She stood up. She needed to move. She went to the window and looked out at the street below. The ordinary morning street, the convenience store owner pulling up his awning, 2 school children on bikes, the complete normalcy of it. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. My best friend keeps telling me to go home, she said. To Atlanta. He said nothing. She's been saying it since Marcus left, since before the pregnancy. She paused. She'd say I should go home now. Would she be wrong? She turned around. He was watching her from the table, still and careful, and there was something in his expression she couldn't entirely read. Not concern exactly. Something more complicated than concern. I don't know, she said. But I'm not going anywhere because someone threatened me. That's not who I am. He nodded, very slightly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. All right, he said. Then here's what happens next. What happened next was 3 weeks of a very strange arrangement. Do-hyun did not move anyone into her building. He did not assign a visible security detail. What he did was considerably more subtle and considerably more unsettling once she understood it. The 3 buildings on her block were all, she discovered, owned by subsidiary companies of the KDH Group, which meant that the maintenance staff, the parking attendant, and the woman who ran the dry cleaning shop on the corner all had quiet, non-specific instructions to be aware and to make a particular phone call if anything felt wrong. She found this out from him directly because she asked him directly, and she'd told him at their second meeting that if he was doing anything in her vicinity, he needed to tell her about it. You're watching my block, she said. I'm making sure the people already on your block are paying attention. That's the same thing. It's more efficient. I don't care about efficient. I care about being told, he told her after that. Not everything. She suspected not everything, but enough that she could track what he was doing and why. They met twice a week in a different location each time. Always public, always busy enough that two people having coffee was invisible. He was always there before her. He always chose a seat with sightlines to the door. She noticed things about him. She noticed that he ate very little, and with the focused joylessness of someone who'd long ago stopped thinking of food as anything other than maintenance. She noticed that he kept his phone face down unless it buzzed, and when it buzzed, he checked it with the specific tension of someone expecting bad news and simply waiting to find out what kind. She noticed that he laughed. Not often, and not the practiced social laugh she'd have expected from someone in his position. The actual thing, which was quieter and arrived slowly, like it had to clear some interior checkpoint before it was allowed out. He noticed things about her too. "You switch languages when you're frustrated," he said one afternoon, about 10 days in. She looked up from her phone. "What?" "You've been speaking in English, and then when the man at the counter gave you the wrong order, you said something under your breath in Amharic," she said. "My grandmother spoke it. I only remember about 40 words." "What did you say?" She looked at him. Something my grandmother would not have approved of. He almost smiled. She told him about her grandmother because it was easier than the silence, and because he listened the way people rarely listened, without preparing his own story while she was still talking. She told him about growing up in Atlanta, the particular Atlanta of her neighborhood, her grandmother's insistence on education as the thing nobody could take away from you, her mother's pride and her mother's fear existing in her at the same time like two frequencies. She told him about nursing school, about the contract offer that had felt like an adventure or an escape depending on what day she'd needed it to be. She didn't tell him about Marcus. Not yet. That was a wound she still needed both hands on. He told her things too, carefully, rationed. He told her his mother had died when he was 11 and that his father, in the absence of any framework for grief, had simply filled the space with work and expectation. He told her that he'd spent his 20s believing the business empire was something he'd been given, and his 30s slowly understanding it was something he'd been trapped inside. He said this without self-pity, in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything, which somehow made it worse. "Did you ever want to do something else?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "What?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Architecture." She hadn't expected that either. "I spent 2 years in a graduate program," he said, "before my father died." "What did you like about it?" He thought about it. "The logic of it," he said. "A building has to make sense. Every decision has a consequence, and the consequence is visible. You can look at a structure and understand why it stands." She looked at him for a moment. "Unlike people." "Unlike most things," he said. Oh. On the 19th day, the forum post came back. Different account. Same image. This time with additional details. Her workplace, her shift schedule. A photograph taken outside the hospital that she recognized as having been taken within the last week because she was wearing the jacket she'd bought 3 weeks ago. Do-hyun called her before she'd finished reading it. "I see it," she said, answering. "Don't go to work today." "I have a shift at 7. Amara." She'd noticed he'd started using her first name without the formality of the day in the coffee shop. She hadn't said anything about it. "If I stop going to work," she said, "whoever's doing this wins. I'm not doing that." This is different from the first post. The photograph means someone has been physically present near the hospital. This isn't just a data leak anymore. She sat down on the edge of her bed. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. She put her free hand flat against her sternum the way she sometimes did with anxious patients. The pressure helped. "How close is this person to your uncle?" she said. A pause. "Do-hyun." "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the honest answer. I have 2 people working on it. I should know by tonight. If it's someone he sent, then we handle it differently than if it's someone acting independently." "How differently?" "I go to him directly." She absorbed that. "And what does going to him directly look like?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that answered her question without answering it. "I'll meet you at the hospital," he said. "Not at the entrance, the side street. I'll be there at 6:45. "You don't have to. I'll be there at 6:45, he said again, and hung up. I was there at 6:38. She came around the corner of the side street in the gray early morning, and he was standing against the wall with his hands in his pockets, not on his phone, not in a car. Just standing there in the cold like he'd been there long enough to stop noticing it. Two men she didn't recognize were stationed further down the street with the specific quality of stillness that she now associated with people doing a job. She stopped in front of him. "You didn't have to stand out here in the cold," she said. "I wasn't sure what the car situation was like on this street," he said. That was not the real reason, and they both knew it. She said, "Did you find out who sent the second post?" His jaw shifted, just slightly. She'd learned that particular tell. It was what he did instead of letting anything into his voice. "Yes," he said. "And?" "It was someone my uncle sent," he said. "Someone who works in building security for one of our subsidiary offices. He's been following you for 8 days. 8 days. She felt the cold of the morning differently than she had 30 seconds ago. "He's not a threat himself," Do-hyun said quickly. "He's a watcher. He gathers information and he reports. But the fact that my uncle sent him means your uncle is escalating," she said. "Yes." "Because you won't agree to the marriage." He looked at her. "Yes." She breathed in through her nose, slowly, the way she did before a difficult procedure, the moment before a needle went in, the moment before she had to tell someone something they didn't want to hear. "What does he want?" she said. "Specifically, what is the outcome your uncle is trying to create?" Do-hyun's voice went very flat. "He wants me to believe that you are a vulnerability. That as long as you are accessible, unprotected, and connected to me in the public narrative, you are something he can use to control my decisions." "And is he right?" The question sat between them in the cold morning air. She watched him not answer it immediately. She watched him process it with the honesty she'd come to expect from him, working through it rather than toward the easiest response. "He's not wrong that I'd make different decisions if your safety were on the table," he said finally. She stared at him. "That's not what I asked." "I know. I asked if he's right that you can be controlled through me." He met her eyes. "That depends on what I decide to do about it." She turned and walked toward the hospital entrance, and he fell into step beside her without being asked. And neither of them said anything for the length of the building. And she thought about a man who'd said, "I don't know," when she asked him why he'd replied. And she thought about 8 days, and she thought about the tiny heartbeat she'd heard in the dim sonogram room. And she thought about what it meant that this man's uncle considered her a vulnerability rather than a person. At the hospital door, she stopped. "I need you to end this," she said. "Whatever that looks like, whatever it costs. I need it to end." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Do you know what ending it will cost you?" His face was very still. "I've known for a while," he said. She pushed through the hospital door. The warmth of the interior hit her immediately. The antiseptic smell, the overhead lights, the organized sounds of a morning shift beginning, all of it ordinary and bounded, and nothing like the street she'd just left. She didn't look back. Behind her, on the side street, Kang Do-hyun stood in the cold and took out his phone and made a call to his uncle's private line, the number reserved for things that were not requests. And when the line connected, he said very quietly, in Korean, "We need to meet, today, not at your office." His uncle's voice was warm in the particular way of men who had never needed to be afraid of anything. "Of course, Do-hyun, I've been waiting for you to call." The warmth was the most frightening part. Do-hyun ended the call and stood there in the January cold and understood, with the clarity of someone who has been moving toward a decision for a long time and has finally arrived at it, that the next conversation he had with his uncle would set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. He'd known it was coming. He just hadn't known what the shape of it would be until he'd stood in a cold morning street and watched a pregnant woman walk into work because she refused to let anyone's cruelty rearrange her life, and understood, with a certainty that landed somewhere below his sternum and stayed, that there were things worth being afraid of, and there were things worth burning everything down to protect. He put his phone in his pocket. He told his driver to move. And across the city, in an office with a view Do-hyun's father had once sat and looked at, an old man who understood leverage the way other men understood weather, as something permanent, something to be read and used, smiled at nothing in particular and waited for his nephew to walk into the most important meeting of both of their lives. The office his uncle used was not the one listed in any corporate directory. The directory office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view. Do-hyun's father had once sat looking at was for meetings with lawyers, city officials, the occasional journalist invited in to write something favorable. It was designed. Every surface in it communicated the same careful message: legitimate, established, permanent. The real office was on the fourth floor of a building in Junggu that the KDH Group had acquired 15 years ago and never developed. The elevator required a key. The corridor smelled of old carpet, and something underneath the old carpet that Do-hyun had never tried to identify. The room itself was unremarkable. A table, chairs, a window with the blinds permanently half-drawn, no view worth looking at, no message being sent. That was the point. Do-hyun had been in this room 11 times in his adult life. He remembered each occasion the way you remember the specific pain of a specific injury. The first time he'd been 22, and his uncle had sat across from him and explained, with the patience of a man who enjoys explaining things, exactly what the organization expected from its new figurehead and what would happen if those expectations weren't met. The last time, 6 months ago, had been about the marriage negotiation. A woman from a connected family, the union designed to cement a particular alliance. Do-hyun had said he needed more time. His uncle had smiled and said, of course. He'd known then that the smile meant the pressure would simply change shape. Now he took the elevator to the fourth floor and walked the corridor and pushed open the door, and his uncle was already there, seated at the head of the table, a cup of tea at his elbow and a phone face up beside it, which was itself a message. He wasn't putting his phone away for this. Kang Jae-won was 63 years old and had the physical presence of a man who had spent his entire life being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. Not through size, he was not large. Through attention, he watched everything the way a doctor watches a patient, clinically, thoroughly, with an interest that was not quite warmth. He had been his brother's right hand for 20 years. After his brother's death, he had simply continued. Do-hyun, he said, sit down. Do-hyun sat. He did not take off his coat. He registered that decision in himself. A small refusal, mostly symbolic, the kind of thing his uncle would notice and catalog and say nothing about yet. You saw the second post, Do-hyun said. Not a question. I was informed, yes. You sent someone to photograph her outside the hospital. Chae-won picked up his tea. I sent someone to assess the situation. The situation, Do-hyun said. You've been meeting with this woman twice a week for 3 weeks, Chae-won said. She is pregnant. Her name is now publicly linked to yours. The situation requires assessment. She's a civilian, Do-hyun said. She made a mistake with her phone. She has no connection to us. She has a connection to you. That connection is my responsibility to manage. Yes, his uncle said, setting down the cup with a small, precise click. It is. Which raises the question of why you haven't. Do-hyun looked at him. The post can be removed, Do-hyun said. The account can be traced and shut down. The man you sent to follow her, he stops today. I need your word on that. His uncle smiled. It was the same smile from 6 months ago, patient, invested. You're making demands, he said. I'm stating what needs to happen. Do-hyun. Jae-won leaned back slightly. I have watched you for 17 years. Since you were 19 and I sat across from you in this room and explained how things were. In that time I have seen you angry, I have seen you grieving, I have seen you exhausted and close to broken. But I have never seen you frightened. Do-hyun said nothing. You're frightened now, his uncle said. Not for yourself, which is interesting. Leave her out of this. She is already in this. You put her in this when you replied to her message. Chae-won's voice remained perfectly conversational. A man in your position doesn't reply to an accidental text from an unknown number. He deletes it and moves on. You didn't, which tells me something about where your head was even before she became a factor. What do you want? Do-hyun said. What I've always wanted. What your father promised, and what you've been finding reasons to delay for 3 years. Chae-won folded his hands on the table. The marriage finalizes the Seo alliance. The Seo alliance doubles our operational reach in the southern corridor. It is not complicated. It's not happening. Do-hyun, not because of the woman, Do-hyun said. Because I'm done. I've been done. I built those companies to have something clean, something that could be separated from all of this. And for 3 years, you've been using them as collateral for agreements I never made. I'm telling you now directly that I am done. The room went very quiet. His uncle looked at him for a long moment without expression. Then he picked up his phone and looked at the screen and set it back down. That's a significant statement, he said. I mean it. I know you do. Chaewon stood. He moved to the half-drawn window and looked out at nothing in particular. Let me tell you something your father told me 2 weeks before he died. He said Do-hyun is too honest for this life. I said that was a weakness. Your father said no. It's a liability, which is different. A weakness is something you compensate for. A liability is something that will eventually cost you everything. Do-hyun watched the back of his uncle's head. He was right, Chaewon said, turning around. Your honesty is going to cost you. The question is what the price will be. Name it, Do-hyun said. Whatever you think walking away costs, name it. His uncle looked at him with something that was almost affection. Almost. Walk away from the companies, Chaewon said. Every one. Full transfer of operational control. You keep your name, you keep your personal accounts, the money you earned before your father died. Everything built after, everything the organization used your face to build, you surrender it, and you leave. Leave. Seoul, Korea, if I decide it's necessary. You build a life elsewhere, a quiet life, a private life. He paused. You take the woman if you want. She is not my concern. Do-hyun was very still. And in exchange, he said, in exchange, she is never contacted, never followed. Her name disappears from every form and every file. The baby grows up with no knowledge of any of this. Chaewon's voice was even and reasonable. You get the clean life you've been wanting. I get the organization operating without a figurehead who has been actively looking for an exit for 3 years. Do-hyun sat with the offer. It was almost too clean. That was the thing. He'd spent years trying to construct an exit, and every path he'd found had walls his uncle had built. Now the walls were simply gone, and that didn't make him relieved. It made the back of his neck cold. There's something you're not saying, Do-hyun said. His uncle smiled again. The third time. And this smile was different from the first two. It was older, and underneath it was something Do-hyun recognized as the specific expression of a man revealing a card he's been holding since the beginning of the game. Your security chief, Chaewon said. Park Sung-jin. Do-hyun's face did not change. He's been with you for 4 years, his uncle continued. Loyal, capable. The man you trusted with everything regarding the woman, her address, her schedule, the building arrangements, all of it. The cold at the back of Do-hyun's neck moved down his spine. Sung-jin is the one who identified the source of the first leak, Chaewon said pleasantly. He came to you with a name, an analyst in building security. Do you remember? Yes, Do-hyun said. His voice was completely flat. That analyst had nothing to do with it, his uncle said. Sung-jin fed you a name to satisfy the investigation and redirect your attention. The leak came from Sung-jin himself. The silence in the room was total. He has worked for me, Chaewon said, since before you hired him. I'm sorry, Do-hyun. I genuinely am. He is very good at what he does. Do-hyun stood up from the chair. He didn't do it quickly. He did it the way he did everything under pressure, controlled, deliberate, each movement chosen, because the alternative was to put his hands on the table and flip it, and he was not going to do that. Everything I said to him, Do-hyun said. Everything I told him about her. Yes. Where she lives. Her schedule. The arrangements on her block. He reported all of it. And the photograph outside the hospital. His uncle paused. That was mine to arrange once I had the information. Do-hyun looked at his uncle across the table and felt something shift in his chest. Not break, exactly. Reconfigure. Something that had been one shape becoming another. You've had someone inside my security since before any of this started, he said. Since before you were in this position, his uncle said. Your father asked me to watch over you. Old habits. My father has been dead for 17 years. And you have been running from what you are for most of them. Chaewon's voice remained gentle. Do-hyun, I'm offering you a way out. Take the woman. Take whatever version of a life you've been imagining when you sit in coffee shops twice a week talking to someone who doesn't know what you are. Take it. Walk away. All I ask is that you do it cleanly. Cleanly, Do-hyun said. Full transfer. No lawyers looking for loopholes. No assets hidden in her name or anyone else's. Clean. Do-hyun picked up his coat from the chair. I need 48 hours, he said. You have 24, his uncle said. He sat in the SUV outside the building for 4 minutes without telling the driver to move. The driver, who had been with him for 6 years and had seen most things, said nothing and looked at the street ahead. Do-hyun took out his phone. He opened the contacts. He stared at Park Sung-jin's name for a long time. 4 years. He had trusted this man with the location of every meeting, with the security arrangements for every significant decision he'd made, with Amara's address, with the details of the building on her block, with the knowledge of how he'd started to feel about the situation, not the feeling itself, which he'd never said aloud, but the decisions that came from it, which were their own kind of confession. He called a different number, one of 2 men in his organization whose line he had reason to believe was clean, because he'd established those lines himself, through channels that bypassed Sung-jin entirely, 6 months ago when he'd started suspecting that something was wrong and hadn't been able to identify what. The man answered immediately. "Find Sung-jin," Do-hyun said, quietly. "Bring him to the Gangnam property. Don't tell him why. If he asks, say it's about the hospital situation." He ended the call. Then he called Amara. She answered in 2 rings, which meant she was between patients or on a break. Her voice had the particular brisk quality of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. "I'm at work," she said. "I know. I'll be brief." He paused. "The man I had tracing the original leak, he was wrong, or rather, he gave me wrong information on purpose." A beat of silence. "Your security chief," she said. She was fast. He'd noticed that from the beginning. The speed of her comprehension, the way she assembled pieces without needing them arranged for her. "Yes," he said. "So everything you told him about me went to my uncle, yes." He heard her exhale, not a sigh. The specific kind of exhale that happens when a person is absorbing something they'd half expected and were hoping they were wrong about. "How bad is this?" she said. "I have a meeting," he said. "Tonight. After that, I'll know more." "That's not an answer to what I asked." "Amara, how bad?" He looked out the window at the gray street. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is no." She was quiet. "If I can end this," he said, "but ending it means I lose everything. The companies, the properties, probably Seoul. Would that change anything? About the arrangement we've had? About whether you'd want me involved in any of this?" He stopped, started again. "About whether you'd want me involved at all." The silence stretched. He was aware of asking too much. He was aware that what he'd just said in the gaps between the actual words was larger than the actual words, and that she was aware of it too, and that it was possibly the worst timing in a situation already full of bad timing. "Call me after your meeting," she said. "That's not—" "Call me after your meeting," she said again. "I'll answer you then." She hung up. Park Sung-jin was already at the Gangnam property when Do-hyun arrived. He was sitting in a chair in the bare room on the 2nd floor, the room used for exactly these kinds of conversations, with the specific composure of someone who has been in bad situations before and survived them through performance, not through innocence, through the ability to perform innocence convincingly. Do-hyun came in alone. He closed the door. He didn't sit. He stood by the door and looked at Sung-jin, and the 2 men who'd brought him in waited outside, and the room had no sound except the city below. "How long?" Do-hyun said. Sung-jin held his composure for exactly 3 seconds. Then something went out of his face. Not guilt. Do-hyun didn't get guilt, which told him more than guilt would have. He got the expression of a man who'd been waiting for this room, who'd known it was coming, and who had decided somewhere along the way that when it arrived, he would stop performing. "Since before you hired me," Sung-jin said. Do-hyun had known from the moment his uncle said it. Knowing and hearing the confirmation were not the same thing. The confirmation landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, the impact, and then the ring spreading outward through everything. "The analyst you named," Do-hyun said. "Clean. Nothing to do with it. You framed him. I gave you a name. You would have found a way to be sure eventually." "You framed him," Do-hyun said again, not louder, "so I would waste time on the wrong person while my uncle escalated against the woman." Sung-jin said nothing. "The photograph outside the hospital," Do-hyun said. "You gave him her schedule." "I gave him what I was instructed to give him. You watched me arrange security for her block, Do-hyun said. You told me what I wanted to hear about where the leak came from, and the whole time you were reporting everything I said and did to my uncle. Yes, Sung-jin said, flat, factual. The performance was fully down now. Why tell me? Why not keep playing it out? Sung-jin looked at him. Because your uncle told me to tell you when you found out. He wanted you to know before the meeting. Do-hyun went very still. He wanted me to know, he said slowly. It was leverage, Sung-jin said. Not just what I reported, the fact that I was there at all. The fact that someone you trusted for 4 years was feeding information to your uncle the whole time. He wanted that in the room with you when you met him. He wanted you to feel how deep it goes. Do-hyun turned around and looked at the door. His uncle had not just revealed Sung-jin as a consequence of the meeting. He had planned the revelation as part of the meeting. The walk to the Younggu office, the tea, the patient explanations, the offer that sounded like generosity. All of it constructed around the moment when Do-hyun would sit across from a man he trusted and understand that trust had been a room with no walls. The offer wasn't generosity. The offer was the second phase of the pressure. Walk away with nothing, or stay and have nothing worth protecting anyway. He'd been given a door. The door had been put there to make him feel like the choice was his. He walked back out of the room. In the corridor, he stood with his hand on the wall and breathed through his nose twice, the way he'd learned to breathe through bad moments. In through the nose, out slow. Register the physical reality of the floor under your feet, and the wall under your hand, and the fact that you are still standing. He was still standing. He took out his phone and made the third call of the day, to a lawyer whose number was not in any directory his uncle's people had ever accessed. A man Do-hyun had cultivated quietly for 2 years, specifically for a moment like this. A man whose entire practice was built around the kind of asset protection that certain powerful people attempted after they'd been told there was nothing left to protect. The lawyer answered on the first ring. I need you in Seoul by morning, Do-hyun said. Bring everything we discussed, all of it. The full package? The lawyer said. Yes. That's, Do-hyun, that's a significant... I know what it is, he said. Morning. He ended the call. Then he stood in the corridor of the Gangnam property and looked at his phone and opened Amara's contact and did not call her. Not yet. Not until he knew whether what he was about to do would actually work, or whether the door his uncle had constructed was the only one available and everything else was a wall. But underneath the calculation, underneath the 4 years of trust retroactively hollow, underneath the lawyer and the asset structure and the 24-hour deadline, something had clarified in a way that the last several weeks had been moving toward without his full acknowledgement. He was done. Not done because his uncle had offered him a door. Done because he'd been sitting in coffee shops twice a week across from a woman who had every reason to collapse and hadn't, who had every right to hate the situation he'd accidentally put her in and had instead met it square on and demanded to be treated like someone with agency in it. Done because he'd watched her walk into a hospital in the gray morning and understood that the things worth protecting were specific and human and not exchangeable for anything the organization had ever offered him. He'd known it for a while. He just hadn't been willing to look at it directly until his uncle held it up and showed him how frightened it made him. Fear, his father used to say, is just information. The question is what you do with it. Do-hyun put his phone in his pocket and walked toward the stairs. And behind him in the bare room, Park Sung-jin sat in his chair and waited for whatever came next. And below on the city street, Seoul moved through its evening without any awareness that a man was standing on the inside of a decision that was going to cost him everything he'd spent 17 years building, and had already decided that the cost was something he could live with, which was more than he'd been able to say about most of the last 17 years. He reached the ground floor. He pushed open the door. The cold hit him immediately, and he stood in it for a moment without moving, and then his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer confirming the morning meeting, and his phone buzzed again with a notification he didn't look at, and then it buzzed a third time with a message from Amara that said only, I made soup. If you haven't eaten, come eat something before whatever meeting you're going to. He read it twice. He typed back, I'll be there in an hour. She replied, the door will be unlocked. He looked at those 4 words for a moment in the cold evening air, and something moved through his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Not relief exactly, not hope exactly, something that lived in the same neighborhood as both and was warmer than either. He got in the car. He told the driver the address. And across the city, in the apartment that still faintly smelled of cigarettes, no matter how many candles she burned, Amara Brooks stood at her stove and stirred something that was more than it needed to be for one person, and tried not to think about what his answer on the phone had meant, and failed, and stirred a little harder, and waited for a knock at the door that would mean the next part of all of this was finally beginning. He knocked at 8:47. She opened the door and he looked exactly the way she'd expected him to look. The controlled exterior still in place but wearing thin at the edges, the way a good coat shows its age first at the collar and the cuffs. He was pale underneath the composure. His eyes were doing the thing she'd learned to read as the indicator of what was actually happening inside him, which was moving fast and not stopping. She stepped back. He came in. She handed him a bowl before he could say anything. He took it because the gesture didn't leave room for refusal, and sat down at her kitchen table, and she sat across from him and watched him eat 3 spoonfuls before he put the spoon down and looked at her. "My security chief has been working for my uncle since before I hired him," he said. She nodded. "I figured that's what the call was about." 4 years, he said. "Everything I told him, every arrangement I made for you, he reported all of it." "I know." He looked at her. You're not more upset." "I'm extremely upset," she said. "I'm just also very tired, and I've been standing at a stove for an hour, and I figured one of us needed to be functional when you got here." She paused. "Eat the soup." He picked up the spoon. She watched him eat and tried to organize what she was feeling into something she could work with. She was frightened. She'd been frightened since the second forum post and hadn't stopped. Just learned to carry it alongside everything else the way you carry a bag that's too heavy, redistributing the weight every few hours so no single part of you gives out. She was angry in a slow, deep way that was different from the sharp anger she'd felt looking at the first post. This anger had roots, it had been growing, and it was pointed at a man she'd never met who had decided that she and her unborn child were acceptable tools for the management of his nephew. And underneath all of it, there was the thing Do-hyun had said on the phone. The question he'd asked about whether losing everything would change anything. She hadn't answered it. She'd said, "Call me after." She'd bought herself 2 hours and used them to make soup and stand at the stove and be honest with herself about what the answer actually was. "Tell me about the meeting," she said. He told her. All of it this time. Not the edited version, not the version with the sharpest edges filed down. He told her about the offer, the full surrender of the companies, the exile. He told her about Sung-jin and the revelation his uncle had staged. He told her about the lawyer he'd called and what the lawyer was bringing and what he intended to do with it. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The offer your uncle made," she said. "Walk away. Clean life. I'm not a target anymore." "Yes." "Are you taking it?" "Not the way he structured it," he said. "He built the offer to look like a door and function like a cage. The terms he set would leave the organization's legal infrastructure, the companies, the properties, under his direct control with no independent oversight. He'd have full operational reach and no legitimate face on it. He'd be more dangerous than he is now." "So you're not just walking away," she said. "I'm walking away and taking the door with me," he said. "The lawyer is drawing up a restructure, a full dissolution of the holding structure, not a transfer. The assets go into a blind trust administered by an independent board. It makes them legally inaccessible to the organization without a paper trail that would take them straight to a prosecutor's office." She absorbed that. "Your uncle won't accept that." "No." "What does he do when he doesn't accept it?" Do-hyun looked at her steadily. "That's what tomorrow finds out." She put her hands flat on the table. "I need you to explain to me what that means in practical terms, not strategy. What actually happens to me and my baby in the next 48 hours. He didn't look away. "The restructure filing happens at 9 in the morning. Once it's filed, it's public record. My uncle can contest it, but contesting it publicly draws exactly the kind of scrutiny he can't afford. His leverage over me disappears because there's nothing left to transfer. The organization gets nothing regardless of what he does next. And if he decides that since he's getting nothing anyway, I'm worth something as punishment." The word sat between them. Do-hyun's jaw shifted. "I have 2 men I trust who are not connected to Sung-jin. They're outside this building tonight. Tomorrow morning, when the filing happens, you go to the hospital through the rear entrance and you stay inside until I call you." And if your uncle moves before morning? He won't, Do-hyun said. He's a patient man. He gave me 24 hours because he believes I'm going to spend them accepting his terms. He won't move until the deadline passes. You're gambling on his patience. I'm counting on his arrogance, Do-hyun said. He spent 40 years being the smartest person in every room. He won't believe I found a third option. Amara looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to trust someone. Not the easy version of trust, the version you extend before you have reason not to, but the kind that comes after you've seen exactly how many ways things can go wrong, and you decide, with full information, that this is the person you're choosing to stand next to anyway. You asked me something on the phone, she said. He went very still. You asked if it would change anything, she said. If losing everything changed whether I wanted you involved. He waited. The answer is no, she said. It doesn't change it. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand something. I'm not a consolation prize for losing an empire. I'm not the soft landing at the end of a hard fall. If this is going to be anything, if any of this is going to mean anything, it's because you decided it on its own terms, not because everything else burned down and I was what was left. He looked at her for a long moment. I decided it before the meeting, he said, before any of today. I know, she said. I just needed to say it out loud. He nodded. She picked up his bowl and his spoon and took them to the sink, and the ordinary sound of water running was almost disorienting after the wait of the last 10 minutes. Sleep, she said. On the couch. I'm not sending you out there tonight. He started to say something. On the couch, she said. And if you argue with me, I'll change the locks. He didn't argue. She woke at 5:43 to the sound of his phone. Not a ringtone, the specific buzzing of a phone set to silent on a hard surface. The sound of something that refuses to be ignored even when asked to be quiet. She lay still in her bedroom and listened to the buzz stop and the murmur of his voice, low and controlled, too quiet to hear through the wall. Then silence. Then his knock on her bedroom door. She was already sitting up. Come in. He opened the door and stood in the frame, and she read his face in the half-dark before he said a word, the way she'd learned to read it over 3 weeks of twice-weekly meetings. And what she read was not panic. He didn't do panic, but the specific reconfiguration that happened to his expression when the situation changed faster than the plan allowed for. My uncle moved up the timeline, he said. How? The lawyer got a call 20 minutes ago. Someone contacted his office. Not my uncle directly, someone several steps removed, suggesting that the lawyer's license before the bar might be worth reviewing if he shows up for a meeting in Seoul this morning. He paused. The lawyer is still coming, but the filing window is now smaller than I thought. My uncle knows something is happening. She pushed back the blanket. Sungjin. Most likely, he may have gotten word out before we contained him. Contained, she said. He's being held. He's not going to be able to communicate further, but the damage may already... He stopped. We need to move faster than I planned. She stood up. She was in her sleep clothes, an oversized shirt and sweatpants, and she didn't apologize for it. What do you need? I need to be at the lawyer's hotel by 7. The filing has to happen before 9, or my uncle will find a way to freeze the process through his contacts at the registry office. Then go, she said. I'm not leaving you here without... Your 2 men are outside, she said. Yes, then go. She met his eyes. I can get myself to the hospital. I've been doing it for a year. Go do what you need to do. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that actually landed, that made you feel seen rather than assessed. Then he said, I'll call you when it's filed. I'll be waiting, she said. He left. She stood in her bedroom in the 5:47 dark and listened to her own breathing and put both hands on her stomach and said quietly, to nobody, or to the baby, or to both. Okay? We're okay. Then she went to make coffee. The lawyer's name was Choi Min-jae, and he arrived at his hotel suite looking like a man who had not slept on the flight and had made peace with that. He was 51, small and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away during negotiations and everything, away the moment the negotiation ended. Do-hyun had found him through a contact in Singapore 3 years before this morning, specifically because he had no existing ties to the KDH group and no reason to owe anyone in Do-hyun's universe a favor. He spread the documents across the suite's desk without ceremony. Do-hyun stood over them and read. The structure was exactly what they'd discussed: dissolution of the primary holding entity, distribution of subsidiary assets to an independent blind trust, the trust's administration bound by a charter that required a unanimous board vote to make any transfer and reported annually to a public regulatory body. No single person could access or redirect the assets without a paper trail visible to anyone who looked. His uncle would get nothing, not the companies, not the reach, not the legitimate face that had protected the organization's real activities from scrutiny for 15 years. There's a secondary component, Choi said, pointing to a section of the filing. The trust charter names a specific beneficiary for any surplus proceeds after operating costs. I took the liberty of drafting it as you indicated. Do-hyun looked at the name. It was a medical endowment, a maternal health care fund, seeded with a figure that was, by most standards, extraordinary. Named for nobody in particular. No strings on it except that it had to be spent on exactly what it said. He hadn't told Choi why that specifically. He hadn't needed to. Sign here, Choi said. And here, Do-hyun signed. His phone buzzed while he was signing the third page. He finished the signature before he looked at it. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, and it said, "The woman is being watched, not by us. Someone else. You have a problem you don't know about yet." He read it twice. He looked up at Choi. "File it now. Don't wait for the 9 o'clock window. File it the moment the office opens." Choi looked at his watch. "That's 20 minutes. File it in 20 minutes, Do-hyun said, and picked up his phone and called the first of the two men stationed outside Amara's building. The line rang 4 times. No answer. He called the second man. 2 rings. Then, "Sir, there's a..." The line went strange. Not dead. Something in the background. A sound that was wrong without being immediately identifiable. Then the call dropped. Do-hyun was already moving toward the suite door. "File it," he said to Choi without turning around. "The moment the clock hits 8, not a second after." He was in the elevator before Choi could respond. The ride to Mapogu took 11 minutes at that hour. He spent them on the phone working through every number that might give him information, getting partial answers, pieces that didn't fit together cleanly yet, but were beginning to form a shape he recognized. Not his uncle. His uncle was patient and strategic, and the call he'd made to Chaewon's private line while still in the elevator had been answered on the third ring by a voice that was too calm to be performing. His uncle was still in his apartment, still believing the 24-hour deadline was running. Someone else. The message from the unknown number was sitting in his head like a splinter. You have a problem you don't know about yet. Past tense on the watching, present tense on the problem. Which meant whoever sent it was close enough to have current information and chose to warn him rather than use it. He was still working on that when the car turned onto Amara Street and he saw the dark sedan. Not the building, not outside the building. 40 meters up the street from it, engine off, 2 occupants visible through the rear window. It had been there long enough that the windows had fogged slightly at the edges. He told the driver to stop. He got out. He walked toward the sedan with his hands visible and his pace completely even, because running told people things, and he needed, right now, to not tell anyone anything they didn't already know. He was close enough to read the plate when the driver's window came down. Marcus Reed was sitting in the passenger seat. Do-hyun stopped. He knew the name. He knew the face from the photograph he'd had pulled 3 weeks ago. Standard procedure, understanding who was adjacent to Amara's life. And he'd filed Marcus Reed under irrelevant, a man who'd left and wasn't coming back, a closed chapter. He looked at Marcus Reed now, sitting in a rented sedan 40 meters from the building where Amara was sleeping, and he understood that he'd miscategorized. Marcus Reed looked back at him through the open window with the expression of someone who'd been waiting and had expected this to go differently. "You're the guy," Marcus said. His English carried Atlanta in it. He looked at Do-hyun the way men look at each other when they're sizing up something they don't fully understand. "She told you about me?" "No," Do-hyun said. "I researched you. A beat." "Of course you did." Marcus rubbed his face with one hand. He looked tired and bad. The specific bad of someone who'd been sleeping poorly for reasons related to their own choices. "I'm not here to cause problems." "You're sitting outside her building before 6 in the morning, Do-hyun said. "Define your terms." "I want to talk to her." "She hasn't invited you to talk to her." "I know that." Marcus looked out the windshield. I saw the news online, her name and yours. I got on a flight. You got on a flight, Do-hyun said. She's carrying my kid. The statement landed in the cold morning air between them, and Do-hyun stood with it for a moment, with what it actually contained. Not just the words, but the claim underneath the words. The assumption that biology conferred standing. Go back to your hotel, Do-hyun said. If Amara wants to speak with you, she'll contact you through whatever means she chooses. You do not approach this building. You do not contact her directly. You do not, he said, and he let something into his voice that he usually kept locked several registers down. Sit outside the home of a pregnant woman before dawn because you got on a flight. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. You got feelings for her, Marcus said. Not accusatory, almost wondering. Get out of this street, Do-hyun said. Marcus held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he said something to the driver, and the window went up and the sedan pulled away. Do-hyun watched it go. Then his phone buzzed again. Not a call, a message from an unknown number, the same one as before, which meant whoever it was had kept the line open. He's the distraction. Look at the building. He turned around. The woman from the dry cleaning shop on the corner, the one he'd arranged to be watchful, the one who was supposed to be one of the quiet eyes on the block, was standing outside her own storefront at 5:58 in the morning, which was wrong because her shop didn't open until 9. She was standing very still and looking at him, and her expression was communicating something with the specific urgency of someone who cannot say what they need to say out loud. He crossed to her in 15 steps. She spoke in rapid Korean, low, close to his ear. She'd seen 2 men enter the building 20 minutes ago. Not residents. She knew the residents. These men had a key. Not to the front entrance, to the maintenance access on the side street. They'd gone in and hadn't come out. Do-hyun turned and ran. Not toward the front entrance. The maintenance access, side street, the door that required a physical key and that he had never given any thought to because he'd been thinking about the front, about the street, about the obvious approaches, and not the infrastructure underneath them. Sungjin had had a key. Of course he'd had a key. He hit the side door and it was already open, left ajar, someone's confidence or someone's carelessness, and he went up the stairs 2 at a time in the dark. No light in the maintenance stairwell. His hand on the wall for orientation, his phone dark in his pocket because light was information he wasn't giving away. 3rd floor. Her floor. He came through the maintenance door into the corridor and it was empty and too quiet. And then he heard it. Not a shout, not a crash, something smaller and worse than both. The sound of her voice, very controlled, very flat. The voice she used when she was genuinely frightened and had made the decision not to show it. She was saying, I don't have anything you want. I'm a nurse. I'm not... A man's voice interrupted her in Korean. Do-hyun crossed the corridor in 4 steps and hit her apartment door. It swung open. Unlocked. She'd told him she'd leave it unlocked last night, and she had. And there was a second where he registered that detail as both the thing that let him in and the thing that had let them in. And the scene that arranged itself in his vision was this. Amara standing in her kitchen doorway in her sleep clothes, her back very straight and her hands visible and deliberate at her sides. And 2 men in the main room, one by the window and one between her and the front door. The one by the window had a phone in his hand. The one between her and the door turned when Do-hyun came through. What happened next took approximately 40 seconds and would later exist in Do-hyun's memory as a series of physical facts stripped of their sequence. The particular sound of a man's shoulder leaving its socket, the edge of the kitchen counter against his ribs when the second man caught him off balance, the sensation of the phone skittering across the floor, Amara's voice saying Do-hyun, not screaming, saying his name is a piece of information, telling him where the second man was coming from, and the floor hard under his knee when he went down, and the man's weight on his back, and the decision that happened somewhere below conscious thought. Not here, not in her apartment, not with her standing 8 feet away. He stood up with the man still on his back and drove backward into the wall. The man dropped. Do-hyun straightened up. He was breathing hard. His ribs were informing him at significant volume about the counter. He put one hand against the wall and breathed through his nose twice and looked at the 2 men on the floor, one holding his shoulder, one very still. And then he looked at Amara. She looked back at him. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't categorize. Not fear, past fear, something that had come out the other side of fear and was standing in unfamiliar territory. Did they touch you? They grabbed my arm. I'm fine. She paused. You're bleeding. He looked down. His hand, where the counter had caught him, had a cut along the palm that was producing more blood than was proportional to the pain, which meant adrenaline was still doing what adrenaline did. He closed his hand. My uncle didn't send these men, he said. She looked at the men on the floor. How do you know? They're too sloppy, he said. Too fast. My uncle plans. He looked at the phone on the floor, the one the man by the window had been holding. They were photographing the apartment, looking for leverage. For who? He crouched down and looked at the phone without touching it. The screen was cracked but still lit. The last action was an upload, partially completed, interrupted when he'd come through the door. He stood up. Someone who knew Sung Jin, he said. Someone who bought the information about you before I contained him and decided to move independently. An opportunist. He looked at her. Someone trying to get ahead of whatever happens after this morning. His own phone was ringing. He answered it. It was Choi. His voice was very precise and very fast. The filing went through at 8:02, Choi said. It's public record. Do-hyun. It's done. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Your uncle's people have been calling my office since 8:03, Choi continued, repeatedly. What do you want me to do? Don't answer, he said. Refer everything to the trust board. That's what they're there for. He ended the call. He looked at Amara. She was watching him with her arms crossed, not defensively, the way she held herself when she was cold, and her eyes were doing the fast, comprehensive thing they did when she was assembling information. It's done, she said. It's filed. The trust is activated. He can't touch the companies now without creating a public record. He paused. He's going to be very angry. Angrier than sending 2 men to photograph my apartment. These weren't his men, he said. When he finds out what just happened this morning, the filing, and this, he looked at the 2 men on the floor again. He'll know someone else moved on his territory without his knowledge. That's a different kind of problem for him than it is for us. She looked at him steadily. Is it over? He wanted to say yes. He could feel the shape of the word, how much she needed it, how much he needed it too. The leverage is gone, he said instead. The organization gets nothing from this point forward regardless of what anyone does, which means you stop being useful to anyone as a target. He held her gaze. That's as close to over as I can give you today. She nodded, slowly, processing it. Your hand, she said. It's fine. It's bleeding on my floor. He looked down. She was right. She went to the bathroom and came back with a cloth, and he stood in her kitchen with 2 men on his floor and his ribs hurting and the knowledge that his uncle's phone was ringing with unanswered calls. And she took his hand and pressed the cloth against the cut with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who did this for a living. Her hands were steady, completely steady. He looked at the top of her head while she worked. He thought about the moment he'd come through the door and heard her voice, controlled, flat, performing calm for the benefit of the men in the room and her own nervous system simultaneously, and felt, again, the thing that had moved through his chest in the cold outside the building last night. It had a name now. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but it had a name. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his uncle's private number. He let it ring. It rang 6 times and stopped. Then it started again. He let it ring again. On the 3rd call, he answered. Do-hyun. His uncle's voice was not raised. It was the specific temperature of something very hot that has passed through anger and arrived at something quieter and more permanent. We need to talk. We talked yesterday, Do-hyun said. The filing is done. The trust is activated. Your contacts at the registry office can call Choi's office. He'll direct them to the public record. A pause. You understand what you've done? Yes. Everything your father built. My father built a cage, Do-hyun said. I've dissolved it. Whatever comes next, you build without my name on it. The silence that followed was 12 seconds long. He counted them. You've made a choice, his uncle said. I made it before this morning, Do-hyun said. This morning I just did the paperwork. His uncle's voice dropped to something very quiet and very final. You have until tonight to reconsider. After tonight, I make my own decisions about what comes next. Make them, Do-hyun said. "They'll be the first honest ones you've made about this in 40 years. He ended the call. His hand was still in Amara's grip. She'd stopped working on the cut. She was looking up at him with an expression he could read fully now. Not fear, not relief, not the complex layered things she usually presented to him. Something simpler, something that was simply there. "Tonight," she said. He said tonight. "Yes." "What does that mean?" He looked at her hand around his, the cloth pressed to his palm. "It means we have today," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we should probably not spend it standing in my apartment with two men on the floor," she said. He almost laughed. "The actual thing. Quiet, arriving slowly, clearing the checkpoint." "I'll make calls," he said. "Someone will come for them. It'll take 20 minutes. "I'll make more soup," she said. "You haven't eaten." She let go of his hand. He watched her turn toward the stove, and the morning light was coming through her kitchen window now, the specific gray gold of a Seoul winter morning, and she was moving through it with the same directness she moved through everything, as if the apartment hadn't just contained two men and a confrontation and the sound of a phone call that had just ended 17 years of obligation. His ribs hurt. His hand was bleeding through the cloth. His uncle had until tonight to decide what came next. And Kang Do-hyun stood in Amara Brooks's kitchen and watched her reach for a pot and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical in its precision, that whatever tonight brought, whatever his uncle decided, whatever shape the next threat arrived in, he had already crossed the line that mattered. He had chosen. Not the filing, not the trust, not the phone call just now. 3 weeks ago, in a coffee shop, when a woman had looked at him across a table and said, "I'm not in whatever this is," and he'd looked back at her and known, with absolute certainty, that he was going to make sure of it, or burn the empire down trying. He'd just gotten to the burning part. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it. Unknown number. The same one that had warned him twice this morning. The message read, "Your uncle is calling a meeting tonight. All senior members. You should know who shows up." He stared at the message. Then he typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came in under 10 seconds. Someone who's tired of the same people winning. He looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at Amara at the stove, her back to him, the morning coming through the window, the soup starting to move in the pot. He had today. Tonight was going to be something else entirely, and whatever it was already moving toward him at a speed he couldn't stop and wouldn't try to, because stopping it would mean going back, and going back meant everything he'd just set fire to had burned for nothing. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked up a dish towel and wrapped it around his bleeding hand, and he sat down at her kitchen table and waited for the soup. And outside the city moved through its morning, and somewhere across Seoul in an office with the blinds permanently half drawn, an old man who understood leverage was making calls that would determine whether today was the last quiet day either of them got for a very long time. The soup was gone by 9. He'd eaten 2 bowls, which she noted without comment, and she'd eaten 1, and they'd sat at the kitchen table with the radio on low. A station she kept on for background noise during long shifts at home, something with unhurried jazz that neither of them was actually listening to, and not talked about tonight. They talked about other things, small things, the kind of conversation that happens when two people are both aware of something large approaching and have made a mutual, unspoken decision to hold it at arm's length for as long as the morning allows. She told him about the first time she'd taken a night shift alone 3 years ago in Atlanta, when a patient coded, and she'd been the first one in the room, and her hands had been completely steady throughout, and she'd cried in the parking lot afterward for 20 minutes. He told her about a building he'd designed in his second year of graduate school, a community library, modest, nothing that would ever actually be built, and how he'd gone back to the rendering recently and found it in a folder he'd almost deleted, and had not been able to explain to himself why he'd kept it. She listened to that one for a moment. "You should build it," she said. He looked at her. "It was a student project." "It was something you made when you were still allowed to make things for yourself," she said. "That's different from a student project." He looked at his coffee cup. The 2 men from the floor were gone. A car had come at 8:30, a quiet operation she'd watched from the kitchen doorway without asking questions. 2 men going out the way they'd come in, through the maintenance access. Do-hyun had made 4 calls in rapid sequence after the car left, none of which she'd fully understood, and none of which he'd translated in real time. She'd let him work. She'd washed the bowls. By 9:15, the apartment felt almost normal, which was its own kind of disorienting. At 9:22, his phone buzzed with a message, and she watched his face change. Not dramatically. A small thing. The slight forward shift of his weight, the way his eyes went to a different focal point. "What?" she said. He looked up. "The unknown number. The one that warned me this morning." "What did they say?" He turned the phone so she could read it. "The meeting is tonight at 10. Seong-Sudong, the warehouse your uncle used before the Yeonggu office was built. There will be 9 people in that room. 4 of them would prefer a different outcome than your uncle. I can give you their names." She read it twice. Then she looked at him. "Someone inside his organization wants him gone, apparently. And they've chosen you to help make that happen. Or they've chosen tonight to make it happen regardless. And they're giving me the information because it benefits them to have me aware." He took the phone back. "Either way, someone in that room tonight is going to move against my uncle. The question is whether that's better or worse for us than my uncle moving against me." She thought about that. "If someone takes him down from inside, the organization restructures," he said. "New leadership, new priorities. The agreement I made, the filing, the trust, becomes a matter for whoever inherits the position to honor or not honor. Would they honor it? I don't know who they are yet." She pushed back from the table and stood up and went to the window. The street below was doing its mid-morning thing, a delivery truck idling, 2 women with strollers moving in opposite directions, a man sitting on the low wall outside the convenience store eating something from a paper bag. The ordinary world continuing. "Reply to them," she said. "Ask for the names." He was quiet for a moment. "If I engage with this, I'm not a neutral party anymore. I'm an active participant in whatever happens tonight." "You're already not neutral," she said, still looking out the window. "Your uncle made sure of that when he sent someone to follow me, when he had Sungjin installed in your organization, when he leaked my name." She turned around. "The choice between participating and not participating stopped being available weeks ago. You're just deciding what kind of participating." He looked at her for a long moment, then he typed a reply. "Give me the names." 4 names arrived within 3 minutes. He knew 2 of them, senior figures, men who had been in the organization longer than his uncle, who had built loyalties to the Kong family name rather than to Chae-won specifically. The other 2 he didn't recognize, which itself was information. New players. People who'd been brought in during the last few years, which meant Jae-won had been expanding, and in expanding had let in people whose loyalty to him personally was shallower than he knew. He spent the rest of the morning making calls. Not to the 4 names. Not directly. Not yet. To 2 other men, people outside the organization's structure entirely, who existed in a particular stratum of Seoul's financial world, where information moved faster than money and was worth more. He needed to know who the 2 unfamiliar names were before tonight. He needed to know what they wanted, because everyone at a meeting like this wanted something, and understanding what they wanted was the only way to understand whether the outcome of tonight was something he could work with or something that simply replaced one problem with another. Amara went to work at noon. She'd pushed back a shift swap she'd arranged for the morning and picked up the afternoon instead, and she'd told him this matter-of-factly while she changed into her scrubs, and he'd started to say something and she'd looked at him with an expression that ended the sentence before it started. "I'm not sitting in this apartment all day," she said. "I'll be inside the hospital. You said yourself your uncle won't move before tonight." "I said he won't move before tonight on his original plan," he said. "What happened this morning complicated things." "Then put someone outside the hospital." "I already have." She picked up her bag. "Call me if anything changes." "Amara, I mean it about calling," she said. "Don't decide things are better handled without telling me and then tell me afterward. I've had enough of that from—" She stopped, looked at him. "Just call me." She left. He sat in her apartment for 10 minutes after she left, not because he needed the time, but because the apartment felt like the last still point before a significant movement, and he wanted to be in it for a moment before the day started in earnest. Then he called the lawyer. Then he called the 2 men he trusted. Then he typed a message to the unknown number. "Tonight. Tell me what you need from me." The reply came, "Just be there and bring proof of the filing." He looked at that for a moment. Then he sent a copy of the trust documentation to a secure cloud address and forwarded the link. The reply, "Good, 10 o'clock. He put the phone in his pocket. He picked up his coat. He looked around her kitchen, the bowls drying on the rack, the radio still going low, the dish towel he'd wrapped around his hand sitting on the counter where he'd left it, faintly stained, and he felt the particular quality of a moment that is going to be referred back to later, one way or another. Then he walked out into the sole afternoon and started preparing for tonight. At 6:15, Marcus Reed called him. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. "I'm outside the hospital," Marcus said. "I'm not going in. I need to know if she's okay." "She's working," Do-hyun said. "I saw the news this morning, the online stuff. Her name." A pause. "Is she safe?" "Yes." "Because of you." It wasn't a question exactly. It was a man working something out by saying it out loud. "Go back to your hotel," Do-hyun said. "She'll decide if she wants to talk to you. That's her decision, not mine and not yours." "I know that," Marcus said. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time difference. "I know I lost the right to... I know." Another pause. "Is the baby okay?" Do-hyun looked out the car window at the city. "Yes," he said. "The baby is fine." He heard Marcus exhale, a long, uneven sound that carried more in it than the man probably intended to release. "Thank you," Marcus said. Just thank you." Do-hyun ended the call. He sat with it for a moment, with the specific weight of a man who'd left and was only now understanding what he'd walked away from, and the particular inadequacy of arriving at that understanding too late and from the wrong direction. He didn't feel contempt for Marcus Reed. He felt something that was almost the opposite, a recognition that was uncomfortable in its specificity. He understood, better than he'd have liked to, what it looked like when a man stood outside something valuable and couldn't figure out how to be worthy of walking back in. He intended not to be that man. He was going to have to survive tonight first. The warehouse in Seongsu-dong was exactly what his uncle's meeting places always were. Unremarkable from the outside, functional within, chosen for the same reason the Yeonggu office was chosen. It communicated that the people inside it had nothing to prove to anyone watching. Do-hyun arrived at 9:47. He'd come in a different car than usual, driven by one of the two men he trusted rather than his regular driver. He'd given his regular driver the night off 2 days ago, for reasons he hadn't explained, which was itself a thing Sung-jin would have reported if Sung-jin were in a position to report anything. The building's side entrance was unlocked. He went in. The interior was lit by work lights strung along the ceiling beams, yellow-white, industrial, the kind of light that flattened everything and made faces harder to read. There were 9 folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle, 6 of them already occupied. His uncle sat at the center. Not the head of a table, there was no table, just the center of the arc, which was its own statement about how he understood his position in any room. Do-hyun took the empty chair to his uncle's left. 5 men he knew, 2 he didn't. The 2 unfamiliar names from this morning, younger than he'd expected, with the careful attentiveness of people who have recently been given more responsibility than they've had before. The 9th chair was empty. Do-hyun noted the empty chair and said nothing about it. His uncle looked at him. "You came." "You said tonight," Do-hyun said. "I said I'd make my own decisions after tonight." Chaewon looked around the room. "I wanted to make them with everyone present." "Then let's make them," said one of the 2 men Do-hyun knew from the list. Han Dong-hyuk, 61, who had been in the organization since before Do-hyun's father consolidated control, who had the specific gravity of a man whose patience had been a professional asset for 4 decades. He spoke quietly, the way he did everything. "Do-hyun, you filed the dissolution this morning." "Yes." "Without bringing it to this table." "There was no obligation to bring it to this table," Do-hyun said. "The companies were built with capital that predated the organization's involvement. The trust structure is legally sound. You can all verify that through Choi's office." "The legality isn't the question," his uncle said. "Then what is?" "The question," Chaewon said, with the same patient, invested quality he'd had in the Jeonggu office, "is what you think you've accomplished. You've dissolved the holding structure. You've made the assets inaccessible. Very good. But the organization's actual operations, the real ones, the ones that don't appear in any trust filing, continue regardless. All you've done is remove the clean layer." "Yes," Do-hyun said. His uncle blinked. "You know that." Of course I know that, Do-hyun said. The clean layer was what I controlled. I can't dissolve what was never mine to dissolve, but I can make sure my name is no longer attached to it, and I can make sure the mechanism your operation was using to access legitimate capital is permanently severed. He paused. You'll rebuild. It'll take time, and you'll have to do it without the cover my company's provided. But you'll rebuild. Then what was the point? Said one of the younger men. He said it without aggression, genuine, almost academic curiosity. The point, Do-hyun said, was that a woman I know and her unborn child were being used as leverage to keep me cooperative. I've removed the reason for that leverage. They're no longer useful to anyone in this room as a tool because I've already given you everything that was in question. Silence. Han Dong-hyuk looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Chae-won. Is that true? Was the woman being used for leverage? The situation was being managed, Chae-won said. That's not an answer, said the second man from the list. A name Do-hyun now knew was Seo Gi-tae, 58, who had apparently grown tired of a great many things in recent years. His voice was flat and specific. We were told the public narrative about the foreign nurse was handled. We were not told it was being actively managed as a pressure instrument. It required a degree of, his uncle began. You used an uninvolved civilian, Han said. Quiet. Absolute. A pregnant woman. You leaked her identity to create leverage over your own nephew. The room was very still. His uncle looked around it. He looked at each face the way Do-hyun had seen him look at things his entire life, assessing, calculating, identifying what could be used and what needed to be removed. And Do-hyun watched him do it and watched the calculation land. The room had changed, not because of the filing, not because of tonight's meeting, because of the specific, undeniable ugliness of what Han had just named out loud in front of 9 people without softening it, and because the 2 younger men, the ones whose loyalty to Chae-won was new and therefore still contingent on him being the kind of leader they'd signed on to work for, were looking at each other in the way people look at each other when a decision is being made. We trusted your management of your family's internal situation, Seo Gi-tae said. We did not authorize this. You did not need to authorize it, Chae-won said. His voice had shifted, not defensive, but the careful patience was wearing through at the edges, and underneath it was something harder and older. I have managed this organization through 3 leadership transitions, 2 government investigations, and a financial restructure that saved every man in this room from exposure. I don't require authorization to handle my nephew. Do-hyun is not the problem, Han said. He is sitting in that chair because you asked him to come, and he came, and he filed the papers and surrendered the companies because you asked him to, and he did it. What he did not do was cooperate with using an innocent person as a threat instrument. The innocent person is fine, his uncle said. That's not the point, and you know it, Han said. The 9th chair was still empty. Do-hyun had been watching it since he sat down, watching it with the peripheral attention he'd learned from his uncle, ironically. The practice of tracking everything in a room without appearing to track anything. The 9th chair was for someone who hadn't arrived yet, or for someone who wasn't coming, or for someone whose absence was itself a message. His uncle looked at the 9th chair. For the first time since Do-hyun had walked in, something moved across Kang Jae-won's face that was not calculation. Something that arrived and was controlled immediately, but had arrived. A fraction of a second of something very old and very tired. Commissioner Yoon is not coming, Han Dong-hyuk said quietly. He called me this afternoon. He's been approached by an investigative team. Someone gave them documentation. The room went a different kind of quiet. Do-hyun looked at his uncle. His uncle was looking at Han. What documentation? Chae-won said. Enough, Han said. Enough that he is no longer able to be in this building or any building associated with this organization. Enough that several other individuals who have provided the organization with particular kinds of protection over the years are currently reassessing those relationships. Who gave them the documentation? His uncle said. Han looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun met his uncle's gaze. He had not given anyone documentation. He had not contacted an investigative team. He had not, in any direct sense, done what his uncle was now understanding had been done. But he had filed a trust dissolution that had required every subsidiary company's financial records to be submitted to a public registry. And somewhere in those financial records, if you knew what you were looking for, were 17 years of transactions that told a particular story very clearly to anyone with the expertise to read them. He had not intended it as a weapon. He had simply stopped protecting everyone from the consequences of what the records contained. Do-hyun, his uncle said. I didn't give anyone anything, Do-hyun said. The trust filing made the records public. That's what public means. The silence was enormous. His uncle looked at him for a very long time. Across 40 years, across a brother's death, across a 19-year-old boy sitting in a Yonggu office being told how things were. Across all of it, Kang Jae-won looked at his nephew, and the patience was gone now, fully, and what was underneath it was complicated in a way Do-hyun hadn't expected. Not rage, not the cold strategic fury that would have been almost easier to face, something older, something that in a different life, between different people, might have been grief. Your father would have hated this, his uncle said. My father, Do-hyun said, would have understood it. A long moment. You've destroyed everything, his uncle said. Not to the room, to him. No, Do-hyun said. I've dissolved what was mine, everything else. Whatever happens next with the organization, the investigation, the relationships that are being reassessed, that's the consequence of 40 years of decisions you made. I didn't make them. I just stopped covering them. His uncle stood up. He stood slowly, the way old men stand when they're in pain they won't name, the careful rearrangement of weight, the deliberate straightening. He looked around the room one more time. The faces looked back at him, and none of them had the particular quality they'd had in rooms like this one for 40 years, which was the quality of men who expected him to tell them what came next. They were waiting to see what they decided. He understood it in the same moment Do-hyun did. The room had shifted entirely while he was looking at his nephew. Han Dong-hyuk spoke again, quietly. Jae-won, go home tonight. Something passed across his uncle's face. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. He looked at Do-hyun one final time. The woman, he said. He stopped. She's not involved, Do-hyun said. She was never involved. His uncle nodded once. A small movement. Contained. He walked out. No one stopped him. No one followed him. The door opened and closed, and his footsteps on the concrete floor diminished and then were gone. And the 8 remaining people in the warehouse sat in the yellow-white light and breathed. Han Dong-hyuk looked at Do-hyun. The trust structure, the blind trust, it can't be reversed. No, Do-hyun said. It requires a unanimous board vote and a regulatory filing. It's designed to be permanent. Han nodded slowly. Good. He paused. Go home, Do-hyun. Do-hyun stood up. He picked up his coat. He walked out of the warehouse into the Seongsu-dong night, the cold of it, immediate and absolute after the work lights inside. And he stood on the pavement and breathed through his nose twice and looked at the sky, which was the particular orange-black of Seoul at night, the city's light turning the darkness into something almost warm. He took out his phone. He called her. She answered on the second ring. Tell me. It's over, he said. A pause. Define over. My uncle left the meeting. The organization's protection infrastructure has been compromised. The companies are in the trust. The leverage is gone. He paused. All of it. He heard her breathe. Are you hurt? She said. No. Where are you? You. Seongsu-dong. Come here, she said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I'll leave the door unlocked, she said. He almost said don't, because unlocked doors had been a vulnerability tonight. Then he understood that she knew that, and she was saying it anyway, and it meant something different from what it had meant this morning. All right, he said. He got in the car. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard the elevator. She'd been listening for it. She admitted nothing, but she'd been sitting on the couch with her hands in her lap and the radio off for the last 40 minutes, tracking the building's sounds with the attention of someone who has learned, recently and thoroughly, to pay attention to what's outside the door. He stood in the corridor, and she stood in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment. He looked different than he had this morning. Not physically. The coat was the same careful posture, the same controlled exterior. Something underneath was different. Something had settled or emptied, or simply stopped holding the same position it had held for a very long time. She stepped back. He came in. She'd made tea. It was on the kitchen table, 2 cups, because she'd known he would come back and she'd known he wouldn't have eaten again, and the soup was gone and she was not going to make soup at 11 at night, but tea she could do. He sat down and picked up the cup and held it the way she'd held her mug this morning. Both hands, the warmth of it. She sat across from him. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. All of it this time, the way he'd told her part 2 last night. No edited version, no filed edges. He told her about Han Dong-hyuk and Seo Gitai and the 2 younger men and the 9th empty chair. He told her about the trust records and the investigation and Commissioner Yoon not coming. He told her what his uncle had said at the end, the woman, the unfinished question, and what he'd said back. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He asked if I was all right," she said. At the end, he didn't finish the sentence. "But that's what it was," she said. "Yes." She looked at her cup. "He used me as a tool for months. He had me followed. He had my name leaked to a public forum. He sent men to my apartment." She paused, and at the end he wanted to know if I was all right. "I know. That's a very human thing, for someone who did all of those things." He looked at her. "Yes." She breathed out slowly. "I don't forgive him. I want that to be clear. It's clear. People are complicated," she said. "I know that professionally. I know it about my patients. I forget sometimes that it applies to people who've done genuinely terrible things." She looked up. "It doesn't make the terrible things less terrible." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She reached across the table and picked up his right hand, the one with the cut, still slightly swollen along the palm, the edges of it cleaned and closed enough to not be a crisis, but still visible. She turned it over in both of hers and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down gently. "What happens to you now?" she said. "I'm not sure yet. The trust requires oversight. There will be legal proceedings. I don't know what shape they take, how much of the organization's activity becomes traceable through the records, what my role in any investigation looks like." He paused. "I'll need a lawyer for some time." Choi, he agreed. "And the companies. The architecture firm you could have had." Something moved in his face. "There's the endowment," he said, "in the trust charter. It's seeded with enough to... There's a fund. Maternal health care. I had it written into the charter." She looked at him. "It was drafted before tonight," he said, "before the meeting, before I knew how anything was going to go." She looked at him for a long time. "You put a maternal health care endowment in the trust charter," she said. "Yes." "Before you knew if the trust was even going to matter." "Yes." She sat back. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at him, and her eyes were doing something he'd learned over these weeks, meant she was keeping something in check that was significant in size. "That's a very large gesture," she said. It seemed appropriate. "Do-hyun." "Yes." "That's a very large gesture," she said again, slower, and her voice had something in it now that was not quite composed. "For a woman you've known for less than 2 months." "I'm aware of the timeline," he said. "I'm a pregnant woman whose baby's father just flew to Seoul and is sitting in a hotel somewhere rethinking his life choices. I know that too. And you put a maternal health care fund in a legal document." He looked at her. "I wasn't sure I'd get to say it directly. I wanted there to be something that said it regardless." She looked at him for a long, long moment. "Say it directly," she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, collecting it. "I want to be here," he said. "Not because of the situation, not because of what happened, or because everything else is gone. Because every time I've sat across from you, in coffee shops, and in this kitchen, and in a hospital side street in the cold, I've been more myself than I've been in 17 years. And I don't know what that means practically, and I understand there are about 40 complicating factors, and I'm not asking for anything tonight." He stopped. "I just want you to know that I'm here because I want to be, not because the empire burned. The empire burning was the consequence of deciding where I wanted to be." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him with both hands still flat on the table and her face entirely open in a way she usually kept locked several registers down, and he saw it, the weariness and the courage in it together, the particular kind of hope that belongs to someone who has been hurt enough to know exactly what hope costs and is spending it anyway. I have 40 complicating factors, she said. I know. Marcus is in Seoul. I know. My contract ends in 4 months and I haven't decided yet if I'm renewing it. I know. And I'm 20 weeks pregnant with somebody else's baby, and I'm not, this isn't, she stopped, gathered herself. I'm not going to apologize for who I am or where I am right now. I know that, he said, and then quietly, I don't want you to be anywhere other than where you are. She looked at him. Then she stood up and took the teacups to the sink, and he watched her back while she stood there for a moment, and the radio wasn't on and the apartment was quiet, and outside Seoul was doing its late-night version of itself, muted and amber-lit. She turned around. There's a prenatal appointment in 3 weeks, she said. They said if the positioning is right, we might be able to find out the sex. He looked at her. I haven't decided yet if I want to know, she said, but I'm thinking about it. She paused. If you wanted to come to the appointment, you could think about it too, whether you want to know. He sat with that for a moment. I'd like that, he said. She nodded. Once. The contained kind. The couch is made up, she said. I did it before you called. You were that sure I was coming back. I was sure enough to make up the couch, she said. I wasn't sure enough to count on anything past that. He almost smiled. The actual thing. That's fair, he said. She turned off the kitchen light. The apartment went to the ambient glow of the city coming through the window, the orange-black Seoul night. Good night, Do-hyun, she said. Good night, he said. She went into her bedroom and the door didn't close all the way. Left slightly ajar, the way the apartment door had been left earlier, and tonight it carried a completely different meaning, and he sat with that different meaning in the near dark for a moment before he moved to the couch. I was still awake at 2 a.m. when his phone buzzed. It was Choi. The message was brief. Regulatory contact confirmed this evening. Full cooperation offered. Timeline for initial inquiry, 60 days. Prepare. He read it and set the phone face down. 60 days. The shape of the next 2 months assembling itself in the dark. The lawyers, the filings, the careful navigation of what the record showed and what his own role in the organization's activities could be documented as. He had been a face and a financial instrument and not an operational decision-maker, but proving that was its own project, and he would need Choi and patience and the willingness to sit in rooms and answer questions for as long as it took. He'd done harder things. He lay in the dark of her apartment and looked at the ceiling and listened to the building breathe, the specific sounds of an old building at night, the pipes, the settle of the structure. Somewhere above him, someone walking across a floor. He'd always slept badly in unfamiliar places. He lay and listened to the building instead. At some point past 3, he heard her moving in the bedroom. Not distress, just the restless repositioning of pregnancy he'd read about in an article he'd found himself reading late one night and not examined his reasons for. He heard her settle and go still again. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about a rendering in a folder he'd almost deleted. A community library, modest, nothing that would ever be built. Clean lines, a reading room with high windows, a children's section with a specific quality of afternoon light he'd spent 3 weeks getting right when he was 22 and allowed to spend 3 weeks getting light right. He thought about it for a while. Then he slept. In the morning, Marcus Reed called Amara. Do-hyun was in the kitchen making coffee. He'd woken first and found the coffee in the third cabinet he'd looked in. And he heard her phone and heard her voice change, and he focused on the coffee and gave her the room. 23 minutes later, she came into the kitchen. She sat down. He put a cup in front of her. He wants to meet, she said, to talk about the baby, what his involvement looks like. What do you want? She looked at the cup. I want him to be the kind of person who deserved to be called. I know that's not an option. She paused. I think I'll meet him, because my child deserves to have all the available information about who their father is when the time comes. And the only way I can get that information is by finding out for myself who he is now. He said nothing. That's complicated for you, she said. No, he said. It's not. And he meant it, in the specific way that surprised him slightly with its completeness. He's the baby's father. Whatever he is or isn't, that's a fact. You navigating that is something you're doing for your child, and I'm not going to make it smaller than it is. She looked at him for a moment. You're a very unusual man, she said. You've mentioned. I mean it as a compliment. I know. She picked up the cup. Outside, a delivery truck idled. The dry cleaning shop owner across the street was pulling up his awning. Two schoolchildren passed on the pavement below, their voices briefly audible and then gone. The ordinary world, continuing. 3 weeks later, Amara and Do-hyun sat in the dim prenatal appointment room while the technician moved the transducer across her stomach, and the monitor showed the shape of a person who was getting less abstract by the day. She'd decided she wanted to know. She told him the night before, in the same kitchen, same table, different weather. He arrived at the clinic 7 minutes early. She arrived 4 minutes after that and found him in the waiting room, not on his phone, sitting very still in the particular way he sat still. Not patient exactly, present. When he saw her, he stood, which was still that old-fashioned thing she'd never commented on. They sat beside each other while the technician worked, the room quiet except for the machine's sound and the heartbeat through the speakers, strong and specific and entirely itself. The technician said something in Korean and then translated without being asked, because she had the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to read a room. Amara looked at the screen. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry, in the same way she hadn't cried at the first appointment, contained, choosing when to spend things. But her eyes went bright, and she breathed through her nose once, slowly. Do-hyun sat beside her and looked at the monitor and was very still. Outside the clinic afterward, the winter had turned. Not warm, not yet, but the specific quality of soul cold that has begun considering its exit. The air had less edge to it. The light was different. They stood on the pavement. She was holding the printed images, and he had his hands in his pockets, and they'd been standing there for about 30 seconds without needing to say anything, which was itself something. She said, "Coffee." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. The almost smile arrived and cleared the checkpoint. The actual thing. "Coffee," he said. They walked. Not toward anything particular. No specific cafe, no arranged destination. Just the direction that seemed right from where they were standing, which was forward, in the light, in the city that had been hers and had become, in some complicated and still unfolding way, a different kind of hers now. Kang Do-hyun walked beside her. Not the mafia boss who had signed away an empire. Not the figurehead of an organization that was currently in the slow, grinding process of being dismantled by its own exposed records. Not the 19-year-old who had sat in a Yonggu office and been told how things were. Just a man, walking in the morning light, with nowhere he needed to be except here. That was, it turned out, enough. It was in fact everything.